I've always loved my work as a graphic designer. Every day, I get to create something new. My office is small, quiet, and perfect for focusing. Most of my day is spent working on client designs, making sure every little detail is perfect. It's exhausting at times, but I take great pride in what I do. Even when I'm drained, I always feel a sense of satisfaction when the day ends. But everything changed after that night. The night that I will never forget. It was a Friday evening, and I was ready for the weekend. I had stayed a little later than usual, around 7 p.m., but that wasn't uncommon. The sun had just set, leaving the sky a beautiful mix of orange and purple. As I drove home, I thought about how I would spend the weekend. Maybe watch a few movies, order some takeout, and just relax. When I pulled into my driveway, I felt the familiar sense of peace that my home always gave me. I had lived in my small one-story house for the past 3 years, and it was perfect, just enough space for me, and not in a busy area, which I loved. It was always quiet, providing the kind of solitude I needed after a long day of work. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, expecting the comforting darkness of my home. As usual, the house was quiet. I flicked on the hallway light and kicked off my shoes, enjoying the feeling of finally being home. The familiar scent of my house greeted me, and I felt a small wave of comfort wash over me. I made my way to the living room, tossing my bag onto the couch, and walked toward the kitchen to grab a drink. That's when something caught my eye. A faint light was coming from the kitchen. At first, I thought it was just the glow of streetlights filtering through the windows, but the light was too bright for that. I had made sure to turn off all the lights before I left for work in the morning, so this didn't make sense. A slight unease crept into me, but I brushed it off. Maybe I'd forgotten to turn something off. Long day, you know how it is. But as I stepped closer, my unease only grew. The light wasn't coming from the ceiling. It was coming from my refrigerator. I walked into the kitchen slowly, my footsteps soft on the floor. My heart began to race when I saw it. The refrigerator door was slightly open, and the light was spilling out from inside. I was sure I had closed it before I left. I lived alone, so who else would have left it open? The quiet of my home, which had always been a source of comfort, now felt eerie. I stepped closer, trying to calm my racing thoughts, but something didn't sit right. And that's when I saw him. A man was standing in front of the open freezer, his back to me. His clothes were dark, dirty, and his hands were inside the freezer, like he was looking for something. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. This couldn't be real. How could someone be in my house? My mind raced with questions, but there was no time to think. I backed away slowly, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The man hadn't noticed me yet, but I didn't want to take any chances. My hands were shaking, and my heart was pounding so loudly in my ears. I thought it might give me away. I moved quickly and quietly down the hallway toward my bedroom. Once inside, I locked the door behind me, my hands trembling as I turned the key. I stood there for a moment, my back pressed against the door, trying to calm myself, but my mind was spinning. How did he get in? Why was he messing with my freezer? None of it made sense. I couldn't stay frozen in fear. I had to do something. My phone was on the nightstand by my bed. I grabbed it with shaking hands and dialed 911. My voice quivering as I explained the situation to the operator. The minutes felt like hours as I waited for the police to arrive. I kept the lights off in my room, terrified that any sign of movement might alert the man that I was still here. I didn't know if he was still in the kitchen or if he had heard me leave. Every creak of the house made me jump. The silence was deafening, and each second that passed seemed to fill the space with more tension. I strained to listen, but all I could hear was the rapid beat of my heart. After what felt like forever, I finally heard the faint sound of sirens in the distance. Relief washed over me, but it was mixed with fear. What if the man heard them too? What if he tried to escape? Or worse, what if he came after me? I couldn't stop my thoughts from spiraling out of control. Finally, I heard the unmistakable sound of the front door being forced open, followed by heavy footsteps. The police had arrived. I unlocked my bedroom door and opened it slowly, peeking out into the hallway. I could see the beam of a flashlight scanning the walls as the officers moved through the house. My body sagged with relief as I stepped into the hallway. "I'm here," I called, my voice shaking. The officers rushed toward me, quickly asking if I was okay and if I had seen the intruder. I explained everything, from the light in the kitchen to the man in the freezer. They searched every room in the house, but the man was gone. There was no sign of him, no trace that he had ever been there. The police told me it wasn't uncommon for burglars to break into homes looking for easy targets, but something about the whole situation felt off. Why was he so interested in my freezer? Why hadn't he taken anything else? I didn't have answers, just questions that lingered in my mind long after the police left. The next day, I installed security cameras and changed all the locks, but the fear stayed with me. Every time I came home from work, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone might be inside, waiting. The once comforting silence of my home now felt heavy, filled with the memory of that night. I never saw the man again, but I always wondered who he was and what he wanted. The police never found him, and the case went cold. But for me, the fear never went away. I still love my work as a graphic designer, but coming home isn't the same anymore. The safety and peace I once felt in my house are gone, replaced by the lingering fear of the unknown. I can't help but wonder, who was the man in my freezer? Was he just a burglar, or was there something darker at play? What did he want from me, and why did he choose that night to show up? The questions haunt me still. Would you feel safe in your home again after something like that? Or would the fear follow you, no matter what you did? I had always loved my work as a graphic designer. My office was small and quiet, perfect for focusing on my projects. It's the kind of space where I can get lost in my work for hours, surrounded by the hum of my computer and the soft tap of my fingers on the keyboard. But that night, everything changed. I'm James, an accountant by day, graphic designer by night. I've always been the type of person who loves the solitary peace of my office, even if that means working late hours. It's the kind of job where attention to detail is key, and I take pride in what I do. It can be exhausting, yes, but the satisfaction I get at the end of the day, when everything is finally done, is worth it. But on this particular Thursday, something shifted in the atmosphere, something I couldn't shake off. It was nearing 11:45 p.m. when I realized how much time had passed. I had been hunched over my desk for hours, trying to meet a deadline. The others had left hours ago, and I was the only one still working. The silence of the office was palpable. It was the kind of silence that makes you aware of every little sound, like the hum of the air conditioning or the creaking of the old wooden floors. Everything around me was still, save for the rhythmic click of my keys. As I stared at the screen, my eyes heavy from fatigue, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye, a flicker of movement. My heart skipped a beat, and I immediately looked up, but there was nothing there. I brushed it off, attributing it to my tired mind playing tricks on me. But the unease settled into my chest. The air felt heavier, and the silence, once comforting, was now oppressive. I shook my head and tried to focus again, telling myself it was just the late hour. 15 minutes later, just as I was about to call it a night, I heard something. A faint noise, barely audible at first, like someone shuffling around. My heart skipped again. I froze in my chair, my ears straining to hear. The noise came again, a bit louder this time, like footsteps moving down the hallway outside my office. My mind raced. Could it be someone who had forgotten something and come back? But who would come back at this hour? Cautiously, I got up from my chair, my legs stiff and hesitant. I walked toward the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I pressed my ear against the cool wood. The footsteps had stopped. It was quiet again. But then, just as I was about to turn back, there was a loud bang, followed by a voice, sharp and commanding. "Hands up!" The voice shouted, and I froze. It wasn't just a voice. It was the voice of authority. It was the police. My stomach dropped. Why were the police here? What had happened? I opened the door slowly, my hands shaking. Standing in the hallway were two officers, their guns drawn and pointed straight at me. I raised my hands instinctively, a cold shiver running down my spine. "What's going on?" I managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. "Are you alone?" one of the officers asked, his gaze scanning the office behind me. I nodded, my throat dry. "Yes, I'm the only one here." The officers didn't lower their guns. One of them stepped forward, motioning for me to move aside. "Stay where you are," he ordered. "We're here because we received a report of a break-in." A break-in? My heart thudded in my chest. A break-in in the office? But I hadn't heard anything. I scanned the room, looking for any sign that someone had broken in. Everything looked normal, the usual clutter of papers, office supplies, and the soft glow of my desk lamp. There was nothing out of place. I swallowed hard. "I didn't hear anything," I said, my mind racing. Had someone broken in while I was working? "We saw a man enter the building," the officer explained, his voice tense. "He was seen heading toward this office." I felt a cold wave of dread wash over me. The intruder had been in the building while I was here, and I hadn't noticed. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I stepped back, and the officers moved past me, their eyes scanning every corner of the room. One checked behind my desk, and the other rushed toward the small storage room at the back of the office. I stood there, my hands still raised, trying to make sense of what was happening. My mind kept racing. How close had the intruder been? Was he watching me while I worked? Minutes passed, each one feeling longer than the last, as the officers searched the office. They opened drawers, looked under furniture, and checked every nook and cranny. The silence felt unbearable, each creak of the building making me jump. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, one of the officers called out urgently, "Over here." I held my breath, watching as the other officer rushed over. They both crouched down, peering under one of the desks. I couldn't breathe as I saw it, the shadow of a figure. My stomach churned as the realization hit me. The intruder had been in the office with me the whole time. "Come out slowly," one of the officers commanded, his voice firm. The figure didn't move at first. Then, slowly, a man crawled out from under the desk. His clothes were dirty, torn, and his face was gaunt and pale, like he hadn't slept in days. His eyes were wide with fear. The officers quickly handcuffed him and pulled him to his feet. I stood frozen, watching as they escorted him out of the office. He didn't say a word, just stared ahead blankly, his expression empty and distant. The whole scene felt surreal, like something out of a movie, but it was real, terrifyingly real. Once the police left with the intruder, I sat back down at my desk, my hands still shaking. The office felt different now, like something had shifted. The once familiar space where I spent countless late nights was now tainted. The shadows seemed darker, the air heavier, as if the room itself had absorbed the fear. I didn't finish my work that night. I couldn't. I grabbed my things and left, the cold night air hitting me as I stepped outside. I tried to calm my nerves, but the fear still lingered. That night changed everything. I couldn't bring myself to stay late in the office anymore, not after what had happened. The thought of that man hiding, watching me while I worked, still haunts me. I can't help but wonder, what if the police hadn't arrived when they did? What if I had stayed another hour? Would I have been the next target? What was the man really after? Would I have seen him before it was too late? What would you do if you were me, alone in your office, knowing someone was watching you from the shadows? Would you trust your instincts, or would you ignore the creeping dread that fills your every step? I've always been a fan of traveling. There's something about getting away, disconnecting from the daily grind, and finding a quiet space to relax. My go-to for finding unique places to stay is Airbnb. One summer, feeling the need to escape the hustle and bustle of city life, I booked a small cabin in the woods. The listing showed a cozy wooden cabin surrounded by tall, majestic trees. The reviews were glowing, with guests praising the owner, Mr. Bolt, for being kind and helpful. It all seemed perfect, so without hesitation, I made the booking. The drive to the cabin took longer than I expected. The road, which was supposed to be a simple country route, became narrow and winding the closer I got. Tall trees loomed overhead, their branches reaching out like fingers, creating a canopy of dark leaves that filtered the light. The air grew cooler, and a subtle sense of isolation began to creep in. But I reassured myself this was exactly what I wanted: peace and quiet, far away from everything. When I finally arrived, the cabin was just as charming as in the photos, small, inviting, with a porch and a rocking chair. Flowers grew in neat rows by the front steps, adding a touch of color to the otherwise dark and forested surroundings. I parked my car and stretched my legs, feeling the long drive in my bones. The air smelled fresh, rich with the scent of pine and earth. It was everything I had hoped for. Mr. Bolt appeared from behind the cabin. He was a tall, older man, probably in his late 50s, dressed in a plaid shirt, jeans, and a straw hat that looked well-worn from years of use. His smile was warm, and his eyes had that kind, welcoming look that immediately put me at ease. "Welcome," he said. "You're going to love it here." He helped me with my bags and gave me a tour of the cabin. His voice was soothing, like a breeze rustling through the trees. The place was simple, but it had everything I needed. A cozy living room with a fireplace, a small kitchen, and a bedroom with a large window overlooking the forest. It was perfect, peaceful, comfortable, and remote. After showing me around, Mr. Bolt reassured me, "If you need anything, just let me know. I live nearby." I thanked him, feeling grateful for his kindness. That first evening, I made myself a cup of tea and sat on the porch, watching the sunset. The forest was so quiet. Only the occasional chirp of a bird or the rustle of leaves filled the air. As night fell, the temperature dropped and the sky turned a deep shade of blue. I went inside, lit a fire in the fireplace, and curled up with a book. The crackling warmth of the fire and the comfort of the cabin made me feel safe and cozy. But as the night wore on, something shifted. I started to notice strange things, subtle creaks and groans in the cabin as if it were alive. The wind outside howled, making the windows rattle. Shadows seemed to move on the walls, flickering in the firelight. At first, I tried to dismiss it as my imagination, but the feeling of unease only grew. The cabin, once so inviting, felt different. It wasn't as warm and welcoming as it had been earlier. The next morning, I woke up early and decided to explore the area. The forest surrounding the cabin was dense, and the trees towered over me, blocking out most of the sunlight. I followed a narrow path that wound deeper into the woods. The ground was soft, covered in a thick layer of fallen leaves. The air was thick with the smell of earth and moss. But something felt off. The silence in the woods was heavier, more oppressive than the night before. I kept glancing over my shoulder, certain I was being watched, but every time I looked, there was no one there. Still, the feeling of being followed lingered. When I returned to the cabin, Mr. Bolt was tending to the flowers by the porch, as he often did. He greeted me with the same warm smile, but today, there was something different about him. His eyes seemed darker, more intense. I brushed it off, blaming my nerves from the long walk, and went inside. That evening, I sat by the fire again, trying to shake off the lingering feeling of unease. As I relaxed, I heard something, faint at first, like leaves shifting in the wind. But the sound grew louder, closer, like someone moving just outside the door. My heart began to race. I sat perfectly still, listening intently. The noise stopped just outside the door, and for a moment, everything was silent. I waited, holding my breath, but nothing happened. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it was just an animal passing by, and I went to bed. In the middle of the night, I woke to the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps. They were moving down the hallway toward my bedroom. My heart pounded in my chest as I lay frozen in bed, not daring to move. The footsteps stopped right outside my door, and then the door handle turned slowly. The door creaked open, and standing in the doorway was Mr. Bolt. But something was horribly wrong. His kind eyes were gone, replaced by a cold, menacing stare. His face seemed twisted, as if two different people were fighting to control it. One side of his face still resembled the friendly man I had met earlier, while the other was distorted, angry, evil, and filled with malice. I realized in that instant that I was trapped in the cabin with him. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, staring at me. I could feel the weight of his gaze, and every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, but I was paralyzed with fear. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he turned and walked away, his footsteps fading into the distance. I lay there, too terrified to move for several minutes. Once I was sure he was gone, I grabbed my phone and called the police. My hands were shaking as I explained the situation, and within minutes, they arrived. They found Mr. Bolt hiding in the woods, just as I described. When they arrested him, they discovered that he had a long history of mental illness. He had been living in the woods for years, pretending to be different people. The friendly Mr. Bolt I had met was just one of his personalities. The other was far more dangerous, and that night, it had taken over. As I drove away from the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that settled over me. The memory of Mr. Bolt's twisted face haunted me. The cabin, the woods, and the man who had seemed so kind were all behind me, but the fear stayed. I will never forget the moment I realized the man who had greeted me so warmly was hiding something far more terrifying. So, what if you had stayed in that cabin? Would you have trusted the kind man at first? Or would you have felt the same unease that I did? What do you think happens when someone is able to hide so well in plain sight? A few weeks ago, I decided to take a break from everything and go camping alone in a remote forest. I had been working non-stop and needed some time to clear my head, to just escape the chaos of the city for a while. The thought of being surrounded by nature, with no one around for miles, felt like the perfect way to recharge. So, I packed my gear and drove out to a forest I had heard about from a friend. Far from the city, hidden away, with very few people who knew about it. Perfect for some peace and quiet. The drive took longer than I expected, but when I finally arrived, the sun was still high in the sky. The trees stood tall and thick, their leaves forming a beautiful green canopy overhead. The air was fresh, the kind that fills your lungs with a sense of calm. I could hear birds singing in the distance, and nearby, a small creek babbled softly over the rocks, adding a gentle soundtrack to the scene. I found a nice spot near the creek, surrounded by tall pines, and set up camp. I pitched my tent, gathered wood for a fire, and settled in to enjoy the solitude. As the sun began to set, the forest seemed to come alive in a different way. The sky turned shades of orange and pink, and the air grew cooler. The fire crackled, and I cooked a simple meal, savoring the warmth and the peace that only nature could provide. The night sky gradually darkened, and the stars began to twinkle, peeking out from above the treetops like tiny beacons. It was the perfect night, quiet, calm, and just what I needed to unwind. After dinner, I sat by the fire, letting the warmth of the flames seep into my bones. The only sounds now were the occasional chirp of crickets and the rustling of leaves as small animals moved through the underbrush. The forest felt alive, but in a peaceful way, like everything was in harmony. Eventually, I decided to turn in for the night. I put out the fire, crawled into my tent, and wrapped myself in my sleeping bag. The night air was cool, but I was warm and comfortable inside the tent. That was until I woke up around midnight. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but then, the voices outside my tent became unmistakable. I froze, my heart racing. The voices were low, almost like whispers, but they were clear enough for me to hear. 2 men were standing just outside my camp. I lay perfectly still, hoping I was imagining things, but the voices continued. "Are you sure this is the right spot?" one of them asked. His voice was deep and rough. The other man replied in a quieter voice, almost nervous, "Yes, this is it. I saw him set up his camp here earlier." I could feel a cold sweat forming on my forehead. Who were these men? What did they want? I tried to calm myself, but my mind raced. I couldn't move. I couldn't make a sound. The silence in the forest, which had been so comforting earlier, now felt suffocating. I was frozen in place, too scared to even breathe. Then came the words that sent a chill down my spine. "Look, I think we should just kill him," said the first man, his voice cold and emotionless. "It's easier, and no one will find him out here." My blood ran cold. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. These men were talking about killing me. My thoughts spun into chaos. Should I make a run for it? Should I try to scare them off somehow? But the reality of the situation hit me. What if they had weapons? And the thought of running blindly into the darkness, with no idea where they were or how far away they might be, terrified me. "No," said the second man, his voice firm but still tinged with anxiety. "We're not killing anyone tonight. We'll find someone else, someone easier. Let's just leave him alone for now." For a brief moment, there was silence. I held my breath, praying they would go away. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure they could hear it. But then, finally, the first man spoke again, his voice filled with frustration. "Fine, but if we don't find anyone else, we're coming back." I heard their footsteps fading into the distance, and I didn't move. I stayed completely still, too terrified to make a sound. I waited for what felt like hours, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. When I was sure they were gone, I dared to sit up, my hands shaking as I listened intently. I could hear nothing, just the gentle sound of the creek and the rustling of the leaves in the breeze. The fear kept me alert. I couldn't sleep. I lay there in the dark, my thoughts replaying the conversation over and over in my head. What if they came back? What if they found someone else to attack? I kept thinking about how close I had been to those men, how they were just outside my tent, talking about killing me. The thought made my skin crawl, and I kept expecting to hear their footsteps again, drawing nearer. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I wasted no time. I packed up my camp as quickly as I could, eager to leave the forest behind. The beauty of the place, which had once comforted me, now felt sinister. The forest, the trees that had once seemed so majestic, now felt like they were closing in on me. Every sound, every rustle of leaves, made me jump. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was still watching me. By the time I reached my car, I was shaking. I threw my gear into the back, my hands still trembling as I started the engine. I didn't feel safe until I was miles away, back on the main road, surrounded by people again. Even then, the memory of those men's voices haunted me. I couldn't stop replaying their words in my mind. The terror I felt that night still lingers. Camping alone had always been something I enjoyed, something that gave me peace. But after what happened that night, I don't know if I could ever do it again. What would you have done in my situation? What would you have done if you had been alone in the woods, listening to men plan something like that? Would you have stayed, or would you have tried to escape? What do you think would have happened if I had confronted them? Would the outcome have been different? The fear I felt is something I'll never forget. It's not just the men who scared me, but the realization that you can never truly be alone out there, no matter how far you go. The carnival was always my escape, a place to step away from the monotony of everyday life. I was just a young boy when I started working there, drawn in by the colorful lights, the music, and the pure excitement that filled the air. The sounds of laughter mixed with the hum of the rides, the sweet smell of cotton candy drifting through the atmosphere. It was a sensory overload, and I loved it. Every evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, the carnival lights would brighten, glowing against the backdrop of the darkening sky. I worked at the game booths, where the crowd gathered to test their luck. My job was simple: hand out the prizes, collect the tickets, and sometimes show someone how to play a game. The games were simple enough: ring toss, shooting hoops, knocking down bottles. But the excitement of the players, the smiles on their faces when they won a stuffed bear or a shiny toy, kept me coming back. I liked seeing the joy in their eyes, feeling like I was part of something special. It was always busy, always vibrant. But as the evening wore on, something strange began to happen. The carnival, which had been so lively and bright during the day, started to shift as night took over. The air became cooler, the crowd began to thin, and the noise started to dull. It was as if the carnival had two sides, one that was full of energy and fun during the day, and another that was darker, quieter, and more eerie at night. The music still played, but it didn't sound as cheerful. The laughter of the crowds seemed muffled, distant. I could feel the change in the air, an unsettling tension that grew stronger with every passing hour. It was during one of these nights that I first noticed him. He stood near the edge of the carnival, just outside the circle of lights. He was tall and thin, his face hidden in the shadows. He didn't join the crowds, or play any of the games, or ride the rides like everyone else. He just stood there, watching. At first, I thought maybe he was just another lonely person visiting the carnival, but as the night went on, I started to feel the weight of his gaze. No matter where I went, whether I was at the ring toss, helping a kid with a game, or even taking a break near the food stands, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was always there, watching. I couldn't see his face clearly, but I could feel his eyes on me. My skin prickled every time I caught a glimpse of him. The strange part was, he never moved closer. He stayed on the edges of the carnival, blending into the shadows, but his presence felt constant. At first, I tried to brush it off, telling myself he was just another visitor, someone who was part of the carnival's strange night vibe. But as time passed, I began to feel like he wasn't just watching the carnival. He was watching me. I couldn't escape his gaze. As the night wore on, the carnival started to close. The lights dimmed one by one. The sounds faded into the background, and the lively atmosphere I'd grown so accustomed to felt like it was slipping away. The crowd had thinned, leaving behind just a few stragglers. I hurried to pack up the booth, my hands shaking a little more than usual. The man was still there, standing just outside the final ring of light, just as I'd seen him all night. I tried to tell myself that I was being ridiculous, that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I moved quickly, wanting to finish my work and get out of there, away from him. As I made my way to the exit, I glanced back one last time to see if he was still there. To my relief, he wasn't. But as soon as I turned back to walk away, I froze. He was standing right in front of me, just a few feet away, his face still hidden in the shadows. My heart stopped in my chest, and panic surged through me. I couldn't move. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body felt paralyzed. I stood there, locked in place, staring at him as he slowly took a step toward me. His movements were deliberate, slow, as if he had all the time in the world. I couldn't tell who he was or what he wanted, but in that moment, I knew I didn't want to find out. I don't know what made me do it, but somehow I found the strength to turn and run. I didn't look back. My heart was pounding. My breath came in short, panicked gasps as I sprinted through the now empty carnival grounds. The carnival, which had once felt like a vibrant, magical place, now felt like a labyrinth of shadows and unease. I didn't dare stop running until I reached the main road, where I collapsed, trying to catch my breath. The lights of the carnival were far behind me now, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me. But that relief didn't last long. The fear still gripped me, tightening my chest. Every shadow seemed to hide something sinister. Every rustle in the leaves sent a jolt through my body. I walked home that night, but even then, the darkness around me felt more oppressive than it ever had before. Every creak, every footstep made me jump. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, following me. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see him lurking in the shadows, but the road was empty. Still, I couldn't shake the fear that gripped me. When I finally reached home, I locked the door behind me, double-checking to make sure it was secure. I didn't tell anyone what had happened. I didn't want to sound crazy, didn't want to admit that I had been scared of a man who might have just been another carnival goer. But deep down, I knew he wasn't. He was something else, something that didn't belong in the bright, happy world of the carnival. The next day, I returned to work, trying to push the memory of the man from my mind. But everything about the carnival felt different now. The colors weren't as bright, the music wasn't as cheerful, and the shadows seemed darker, more ominous. I kept looking for him, expecting to see him standing in the same spot, watching me. But he was gone. The carnival moved on to the next town a few days later, and I left with it. I never saw the man again, but the memory of that night stayed with me. Even now, years later, I can still feel his eyes on me, cold and unblinking, watching me from the shadows of the carnival. I've never told anyone about him, and I probably never will. Some things are better left unsaid. What do you think? Was it just a strange encounter, or was something more sinister at play? Do you think the carnival was hiding something, or was it all just in my head? What would you have done if you were in my shoes, feeling the weight of someone's gaze from the shadows? Would you have confronted him, or run like I did?